Well, good morning, everyone. It's normal to have a microphone. It's quite unusual to have a camera. So, is this taking me all the time, Paul, or is it just once?
It's going to take you the whole time.
Okay, that's all right. That's fine. Don't worry. I shall have to get used to it. I hope you can hear me at the back. Am I audible? Just about? Right, I'll do my best. I feel obliged this morning to talk about the parable of the prodigal son. I know it's terribly familiar, but it is a rather splendid story, and it is, along with the parable of the Good Samaritan, probably the best known of all the parables. The background to it, as far as the kind of customs are concerned, are apparently that in the time of Jesus it was normal for a father to apportion his property to his children during his lifetime, but what he apportioned would only be actually received upon his death. So in other words, the contents of the will were known in advance, what it effectively means. Now, when we come to try to understand the parable and apply it, I think we can look at it at two or three different levels, in other words, in two or three different frameworks. The obvious one, the one that we need to look at first, is the context of what's happening in Luke 14 and 15. The occasion for the parable is really what you find in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 15, where Jesus is clearly receiving and actually sharing a meal with tax collectors and sinners, as they're called. And the Pharisees and scribes find this to be quite inappropriate, that he should receive sinners and eat with them. So that provides the immediate context, and it's not difficult to see how the figures in the story relate to that context. The younger son is clearly one of those who the Pharisees and scribes regard as the sinners. The story suggests that this man the sinner then has taken what his father, what God gives to him, and treats his father as though he's already died, because he wants his money now, and apparently receives it. And he then cuts loose from father and goes off to enjoy the freedom away from home and enjoying the things that his father has given him. So this is an act of rebellion. This is the preference to enjoy his father's money but not his father. And he wants independence and autonomy. It's, of course, the essence of human sin that when we do that we wish to be freed from the irritating tutelage of God, and to be able to do as we think. And this proves, of course, as the story tells us, to be a foolish course. He wastes his inheritance and then finds himself in a desperate plight. He has to hand himself over to strangers, and if you think about the context, this would mean that he, a Jew, has probably become the servant of Gentiles, and that would account for the fact that he has contact with that most abhorred of animals among Jews, the pigs. And he finds himself in a condition of hunger. Now, I think we ought to understand the hunger not simply in terms of physical hunger, and his plight not simply in terms of loss of all his money. What's being depicted here is a condition in which one is poor and in need, despite perhaps being rich. A few years ago I read a review in the newspaper about one Paul Raymond, whose name might still be known to you. He was famous for the founding of some rather sleazy review bar in London and associated magazines, and he appears to have accumulated a vast wealth, I mean, not surprisingly. And the review said of the obituary said of him that in fact his life was poor. He had a poor social life, a poor family life. He fell out with his son, his daughter died of drugs, he had no hobbies, and the obituary finally said he was, I quote, ill-equipped to enjoy or constructively employ such wealth, so rich and yet profoundly poor. And that's the condition really of this man. He's taken wealth but finds himself poor. The one thing about the younger son, though, is that unlike the lost sheep or the lost coin in the preceding two parables, he is able to contribute to his own restoration. And his contribution is simply to reflect upon his plight and to realize the folly of the course that he's followed. And the most positive thing about him is that he knows where to go in that situation. He begins to realize what he has lost and says, I will go back to my father. And he goes, expecting to be treated, as you know, as one of the father's hired servants. So that story in itself is fairly clear, and we can see how it relates pretty obviously to the tax collectors and sinners at the beginning of the chapter. And it's equally clear, I think, how the elder son can be related to the Pharisees and the teachers. The story as a whole, in its final verse, includes a kind of rebuke to the elder son for his attitude. Remember, the father's words are loving, but they are reproving at the same time at the end of the chapter. And he is reproved because of his sense that he has suffered injustice from his father, that his father has not treated him as well as he treated this renegade son. And he has a sense of jealousy. You feel almost he envies the younger son, the good time he's had for a little while, whereas he's never had a good time. And he has a very uncharitable description of his brother's career. Remember, whom he describes as this son of yours, as if he's got nothing to do with him. And he says of him that he has devoured your property with prostitutes. Well, we don't know that. That's his assumption. I mean, he may well be right, but the most important thing about the younger son, the really key thing, I think, is verse 29. When he says to his father, look, these many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command, yet you never gave me a younger kid that I might celebrate with my friends. And as has often been pointed out, his idea of a celebration, his idea of fun, is to get away from father as well, to be with his friends. In other words, he has no more pleasure in his role as dutiful son with father than the younger son had. The younger son broke out. This man, although remaining at home, has inwardly been distant. And it's interesting that in verse 29, the word where it says served is actually the word that relates to the word slave. I have served you like a slave is what it is implying. Not like a son, not even like a hired servant, but like a slave. So he's been as far away really as his brother has been. In fact, neither of these two brothers has sought or shared in the joy and the company of their father. And so this elder son really is in as much need of repentance as is the younger. The difference is that he's not aware that he has that need. And the result is that both are welcomed by the father at the end of the story, but the younger son is welcomed without rebuke because he has rebuked himself. whereas the elder son is rebuked because he has as yet failed to realise the situation. But it's easy to think that these two sons then are the two key figures in the story, but it's quite, I think if one thinks about it, the really important figure in the story is the father. And what this parable is I think centrally asking is, what kind of relationship with the father, what kind of service do these sons do for him? Is it freedom or is it slavery? The younger son has regarded father's service as something to be escaped from, and realised eventually that any other form of service away from his father, that is the true slavery. Whereas the elder son has continued to see that service as slavery. And in the end it's a true relationship to the father that is at the heart of the story. The father is revealed as a figure of unending compassion and forgiveness and understanding. But neither of these sons has really understood him. He surpasses the expectations of the younger son, and he shocks the elder son by his generosity. And perhaps the most important lines come, as you might expect, at the end of the story. Look at what the father says to his elder son, verse 31. Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. Now what that's saying is that this father regards both of these two, both errant in different ways, as still his sons. Both of them are wanted. Both of them are welcomed. And he's telling them that the true riches are to be his son and to be with him. You are always with me. And then he adds these words, all that is mine is yours. Now I don't know whether you'll recognise the similarity. I've probably said this before here, but anyway. Remember John 17, verse 10, where Jesus says to his Father, all mine, this is my version here, all mine are yours and yours are mine. In actual fact, in the Greek, that is identical to the words here of verse 31. All that is mine is yours. So here you have a son, a father, who wishes to share everything that he possesses with his children. And he wants them to recognise and appreciate all that is his, because it is his, because it comes from him, and because it will be shared with him. That is the condition that the father wants. He doesn't want hired hands. He doesn't want slaves. He wants sons, daughters, children who wish to be with him and who enjoy what he alone is able to give and enjoy it because it is his. Well, now it's fairly obvious, I think, how that story relates to the immediate context of the chapter, this criticism of Jesus by the Pharisees and scribes. But I think we can put it into a larger context as well. If you go back into chapter 14 of Luke, you have the parable of the great banquet. And remember, this is the story about the invitation by this great man to a banquet, and his inviting guest. And the feast, of course, is a familiar figure in the Gospels for God's riches, and in particular for the riches of his kingdom, to which he has invited people. But these people have got more pressing things that come before them. So what does this man do? Well, in verse 21, he says, "Go out quickly to the streets and lanes of the city and bring in the poor and crippled and blind and lame." Now I think the way we perhaps ought to see this is that those who are invited but who are making excuses, are the right thinking among Israel. These are effectively the scribes and Pharisees, the righteous. And then this list in verse 21, the poor and crippled and blind and lame, are probably precisely those sinners and tax collectors and the like. Still, though, you notice, within the city, within Israel. But then, in verse 23, the master says to his servant, go out to the highways and hedges. In other words, go out outside the city. And that probably is talking about the gospel going out beyond the confines of Israel to Gentiles. And when you think about this parable of the prodigal son in the context of the calling of Gentiles, you can see how well the roles fit. The attitudes of the elder son are almost precisely mirrored in the way you find in the later part of the New Testament Israel responded to the preaching of the gospel to Gentiles. In Acts you'll find repeatedly that Paul's preaching is hampered by jealousy of the Jews. It actually calls it jealousy, for example, in Antioch of Pisidia in chapter 13, and again in Berea in chapter 17, and again in chapter 21 when Paul gets back to Jerusalem. There is jealousy over the calling of these unrighteous Gentiles, exactly as in the parable. You also have the disparagement of Gentiles in the same way that the elder son disparages his younger brother. I don't want to talk about Romans this morning really, but first chapter of Romans contains that lengthy description of Gentile sins as seen through the eyes of Jews. All the terrible things that they do. And then in the following chapter of Romans, you have Paul turning the table on Jewish readers by pointing out that they are in fact no better than Gentiles, which is what, of course, is true in the parable as well, that the elder son is really no better than the younger. And the issue of slavish service is, of course, one that's very prominent in Paul's letters, prominent in Romans 7, where he describes being under the bondage of the law, or Galatians 4, where he talks about Jerusalem that is now is in bondage, and so on. In fact, what this parable gives us is a model, a picture of God's atonement, his offer of reconciliation and redemption to all mankind, to Jews and Gentiles alike. And I'm struck, when I read this parable, one thinks of the end of Romans 3, where Paul writes, is God the God of Jews only? Is he not the God of Gentiles also? Yes, of Gentiles also, since God is one, he will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith. And that's what this story is telling us. God receiving back those who are far away and those who are near, so they should both come and become his children, his sons in truth. So that's a second context in which one can understand this story, a wider context, the story of the spread of the gospel to Gentiles as the New Testament develops. Well, now, as I said, I've suggested we can look at the parable in terms of Jesus' own time and what was happening in his own life and his ministry. I've suggested that it can be read in terms of the later development of the spread of the gospel. Now, in doing that, that's all very well so far, but what we're doing is, as it were, keeping this story at arm's length. We're reading it in context other than our own. And the ultimate context is one that makes it applicable to ourselves. Because the younger son, when you really think about it, is in a way an image of humanity at large. Humanity at large, right from the story of Adam, has done what the younger son did. We have cut loose from God. We receive amazing gifts from him, gifts and abilities, and we exploit them, and we exploit his world and its riches, and we find ourselves collectively now pretty much in the condition of the younger son, left with the husks, in a situation of some desperation in terms of environment and resources and our ability to live together, and all the rest. Humanity is in an extreme case because of that initial act of rebellion and its consequences upon our actions and our thinking. Well, now, if that's the case, who's the elder son? And I suppose the elder son, in that context, has to be those who are believers, and that means us. I read this parable a year or two ago in our Bible reading group, and I was interested and somewhat surprised initially by the reaction of the people in the group. Some of them actually felt that the elder son had got quite a case, really. It was unjust, wasn't it? Clearly unfair. Sympathising with his sense. And I dare say that when we read the parable, we have at least a pang of recognition for his feelings. And are we not, in fact, prone to adopting his kind of stance? As a community, we've not been free of that tendency to disparage unbelievers and to attribute to them all the worst motives. And have we not been a bit too happy in our exclusiveness and willing to write off, condemn those who fail, and use that unlovely expression, the world, to mean everybody else but us? And are we entirely free of slavishness? Are we entirely free of making rules and being legalistic in our thinking, in our approach to such practical issues as marriage? We, and probably most ecclesias, have a constitution which used to have bound in with it the, quotes, commandments of Christ. And that seems to me a very strange thing to do, because it immediately makes us look like as if we're a community who have rules, a rule book to be kept, as though we had a law. And is our service to God entirely, or has it entirely been free of that motivation of that comes with thinking of God as a lawgiver, that our worship is tinged with fear? We have a tradition that you come to the breaking of bread to be rapped over the knuckles by